Thanksgiving. Football, turkeys, carbo loading, and political arguments with your extended family. Apart from the 4th of July, there may be no more American holiday. From the controversy it represents about our history to the way we celebrate it. Now, we are fast approaching the 400th anniversary of the first Thanksgiving, sort of. YouTube analytics show that I have a small audience outside of the United States, so allow me to quickly summarize the holiday. Also, please subscribe. Celebrated on the fourth Thursday of November each year since 1941, on Thanksgiving Day it is common for American families to share a meal, attend religious services, and review special sporting events, usually football. Oh, and argue with extended family members about politics. I cannot stress that enough. In addition, Thanksgiving has taken a public face with major festivals such as Thanksgiving Day parades, and it's made its way into the public school system where children are usually given time off school to celebrate it. Now, historically, there have been many different meanings of the term Thanksgiving and many different days that are Thanksgiving days, but currently most Americans understand Thanksgiving as commemorating a meal shared between colonists from England known as Pilgrims and local Native Americans known as the Wampanoags. This event occurred in what is now the town of Plymouth, Massachusetts, the second successful colony established by the English in North America. That said, there are numerous questions surrounding Thanksgiving as a holiday, so allow me to address a few of those now. Question number 1, was there actually a Thanksgiving feast? Now, internet edgelords will like to claim that the whole thing is actually just made up, but we do have documentation of this event. The most well-known historic account comes from a man named Edward Winslow. Edward Winslow was one of the leaders of the Plymouth colony. Winslow recorded a feast occurring, which included around 50 some odd colonists and about 90 Wampanoag Native Americans. Now, this feast was probably held at the end of September, not November, and it was in fact a harvest feast designed to give thanks for a healthy harvest and a good collection of meat. In particular, this would have included plants such as corn, squash, and animals such as fish and eel, which the Pilgrims had been taught to collect and grow by the last surviving descendant of a local Native American village named Tisquantum, or known in English as Squanto. This fact cannot be overstated, as it represents the role that Native Americans have always played in the history of the United States before there was even a United States. Edward Winslow's work, known as Mort's Relation, was written in 1621, and it tells the history of the colony up to that point, and it ends with an account of the Thanksgiving feast. Quote, "Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, that so we might after a special manner rejoice together, after we had gathered the fruits of our labor. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl, with as little help besides, served the company almost a week, at which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest of their great king Massasoit, with them some 90 men, for whom 3 days we entertained and feasted. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God we are far from want, that we often wish you partakers of our plenty." According to modern Wampanoag Native American accounts of the feast, Native Americans came to the feast because they thought there was going to be a war, not because they were invited. During the festivities, the Pilgrims had shot off some of their muskets in celebration, and so almost 100 Wampanoag warriors showed up. But instead, the Pilgrims invited them to eat with them. Now, I've personally always thought of this as sort of an act of self-preservation, not so to speak an act of charity. Well, there's no records of this being on the minds of any of the Pilgrims. I cannot help but believe that if a force 2 times the size of your population shows up, armed to the teeth, you're going to try to avoid some conflict. This meal, in recent historiography, has come to be seen as the first Thanksgiving, although it took place in September, not November. There were, of course, other harvest festivals known as Thanksgivings, including one 2 years later in 1623, and some scholars currently debate if there was an even earlier harvest festival or Thanksgiving. However, that's for the academics to argue. My question is, what did they actually eat at the first Thanksgiving? Well, the question of what the Pilgrims actually ate has been shaped by our current Thanksgiving diet. Today, a common Thanksgiving meal would include turkey, gravy, cranberry sauce, stuffing, potatoes, roasted vegetables, and a pie of some sort. What we know about the first Thanksgiving is that it was probably mostly meat. Sorry, vegans, your tofu turkey has no basis in tradition. I'm just giving you a hard time. Put a pin in that, we'll come back to it. But yeah, wild turkey meat, wild deer meat, and possibly even fish and eel. There were some vegetables, notably corn, beans, and squash, and some roasted pumpkin, but there would have been no pumpkin pie as we recognize it. Sugar, a key ingredient in any pie, was a Eurasian crop, and if there was any sugar at the first Thanksgiving, it might have been used as a seasoning, though not for a cranberry sauce. What did they drink at the first Thanksgiving? Well, there's no consensus among scholars, but it was probably alcoholic, either cider or beer. Now, beer requires wheat, and since wheat was probably in short supply in New England, and there were wild apples in New England, I'm personally leaning a little more to the cider side of this debate. Sorry, hipsters. So, when did Thanksgiving become an official holiday? Well, as I mentioned earlier, there have been many different days of Thanksgiving in early American history, as early as George Washington's Thanksgiving Proclamation in 1789, quote, "that we may all then unite in rendering unto God our sincere and humble thanks for Providence's kind care and protection of the people of this country previous to their becoming a nation." However, despite Washington's intention of a day of Thanksgiving, the concept was largely unknown in the southern part of the United States. Now, this reflects the regionalism that characterized the early United States, and that the southern parts of the United States saw their legacy as originating in Virginia and not in New England. Enter Sarah Josepha Hale, a self-taught New England socialite and creator of the children's nursery rhyme, Mary Had a Little Lamb. She spent 20 plus years trying to get the New England concept of a day of Thanksgiving recognized on the national level, writing letters to presidents and other prominent figures. In 1827, Hale published a book, Northwood, A New England Tale, which is a general social survey of the United States at the time, a promotion of Yankee or New England values, and a push to send freed slaves back to Africa. Wait, what? One particular point of interest, however, in this book is that it described a traditional Thanksgiving meal, which included foods we would now recognize as part of Thanksgiving. Quote, "the pumpkin pie, an indispensable part of a good and true Yankee Thanksgiving." Hale hoped that a nationwide Thanksgiving holiday would unify the country as regionalism and disputes over slavery continued to grip the U.S. throughout the 1840s and 50s. Sadly, Civil War, so yeah, I guess that didn't really work. Or did it? It was in the context of a massive civil conflict that President Abraham Lincoln thought a nationwide holiday was just what the country needed. And finally, Hale's appeals fell on listening ears, and Abraham Lincoln proclaimed a Thanksgiving holiday in 1863, quote, "I do therefore invite my fellow citizens in every part of the United States to set apart and observe the last Thursday of November next as a day of Thanksgiving, and I recommend to them that while offering up the ascriptions justly due to God, they do also with humble penance for our national perverseness and disobedience, commend to his tender care all those who have become widows, orphans, mourners, or sufferers in the lamentable civil strife which we have unavoidably engaged." However, Lincoln did not set this down in law. That would have to wait until President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who in 1939 set it to the third Tuesday in November. Why the change of the date? Well, business leaders were concerned about profits, with only 24 days of shopping before Christmas after Thanksgiving, and so pressured FDR to move the date. I guess Black Friday also has deep roots in American history. That said, the change was incredibly unpopular. Schools and football teams had planned around the last Thursday in November for years up to that point, and so were left in the lurch. So unpopular was this that in 1941 the date was changed back to the fourth Thursday in November. Officially, regardless of if there are 4 or 5 Thursdays in November. Now, here is the interesting thing. Neither Hale nor Lincoln's description of Thanksgiving centered around the first Thanksgiving meal with the Indian story. So where did that come from? Well, Edward Winslow's book, Mort's Relations, was republished in the 1840s, and this is probably the source of the popularization of the first Thanksgiving feast with the Indians idea. Beginning in the 1860s and onward, various paintings and images of that legendary first meal, usually not historically accurate, appeared in major publications such as Harper's Weekly. And the rise of the public education system and the trend of mass migration into the United States in the 1880s meant that the first meal story became a major part of the education system, both as a founding legend for U.S. history and later as a way to explain America's origins as a nation of immigrants. The first major Thanksgiving parade was held in Philadelphia in 1920 and has since become a major part of any Thanksgiving celebration. And football has also become a major part of the celebration. In 1882, the Intercollegiate Football Association, one of the earliest football associations, decided to hold all future annual collegiate team championship games in New York City on Thanksgiving Day. The professor Robert McKenzie at Wheaton College remarked that this change helped bring the southern states around to the idea of Thanksgiving. Wait a second, I heard the first official Thanksgiving celebrated the massacre of Pequot Native Americans. Is that true? So this is a commonly brought up story related to the concept of the first Thanksgiving, and like the story of the meal in 1621, is itself a bit muddled. Now, the massacre of Pequot Indians in 1637, known as the Mystic Massacre, was an act perpetuated by the colonists and their Native American allies against Pequot Native Americans, who they had been at war with. This is described as a massacre because there were few to any warriors present at the actual site of the conflict. The totality of the violence, which resulted in the death of at least 400 Pequot women, children, and the elderly, and the sale of another several hundred into slavery, has been described by several scholars as a genocide. The Pequot tribe effectively disappeared until the late 20th century. After the massacre, John Winthrop, the governor of the Massachusetts colony, wrote in his journal, quote, "There was a day of Thanksgiving kept in all the churches for the victories obtained against the Pequots." However, contrary to what is often claimed, this is actually not the first official use of the term Thanksgiving, or the first officially declared Thanksgiving. 7 years earlier, Thanksgiving had been declared to celebrate a good harvest. Still, I think this is an important topic to discuss, in part because it highlights the terrible relationship with the United States and the Native Americans, and how we either completely ignore Native Americans in American history, or we relegate them to footnotes. So for example, the Wampanoags, the native group which helped the Pilgrims survive and celebrated that first Thanksgiving, over the next 100 years found themselves pressured into converting into Christianity, lost their traditional lands to increasing numbers of settlers. After King Philip's War, in which some Wampanoags had fought against the colonists, many Wampanoags were sold into slavery in the Caribbean. To this day, Wampanoags and other Native American groups continue to suffer from lower life expectancies and higher rates of chronic illness compared to other groups of Americans. Now, that history of pain and violence does not make its way into the story of the first Thanksgiving, and this ignorance begins early in American public school systems. Kindergarten classes across the country will regularly dress up and reenact the first Thanksgiving, and it's usually pretty bad. Specifically, how Native Americans are depicted. For example, Wampanoags do not wear feathered headdresses, and they did not live in teepees. That may seem like a small thing, but it reflects our total lack of understanding about anything related to Native American history and culture. And this is the reason why many Indigenous Americans protest or do not celebrate, or perhaps remember this very particular day in a different context than most Americans.
Hey, do your people even celebrate Thanksgiving?
We did. Once.
Which leads me to my very last question. Should I celebrate Thanksgiving? I mean, yeah, if you want to. I'm not advocating that we celebrate the genocide against Native American peoples. To be absolutely clear here, over time the meanings of holidays and celebrations change, and that means that you, as an individual, are free to celebrate Thanksgiving in any way you see fit. The original creation of the holiday was not explicitly linked to the meal in 1621. That connection was created in the latter half of the 19th century. The original holiday was a day of thanks for the nation being preserved during the Civil War, and a time of prayer and reflection with family and friends. Remember that joke I made about vegans and their tofu turkeys? Hey, I mean, why not? If that's how they want to celebrate things. We pardon turkeys at the White House every year. When I was in university, my friends and I called it Friendsgiving because most of us were so far from home, we could not celebrate it with our families, but we celebrated it with one another. And I have a few friends who don't celebrate Thanksgiving at all because they have very strained relationships with their families or negative memories of Thanksgiving as a child. I also know one Native American who takes this day and invites strangers into their home to educate them about Native American cultural practices as well as food preparation. So this week, as we approach the 400-year anniversary of the event known as Thanksgiving, although we've probably already passed it, while I would encourage you to celebrate it with friends or family and take time to reflect and be thankful, in truth, you do what you need to do and you celebrate it as you see fit. If you would like to know more about what was discussed here, may I recommend James Baker's book, Thanksgiving, A Biography of an American Holiday. I want to thank you so much for joining me, and I hope that you and your loved ones can celebrate a happy Thanksgiving together, and I'll see you next time.